The grand old building of the Ethelgerd Conservatory felt like a living thing that evening. Its high, arched windows glowed like warm honey against the twilight, and the sound of chatter and clinking glasses spilled out onto the manicured lawn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, polished wood, and a quiet, unquestioned sense of importance. This was Professor Alistair Finch's annual spring soiree, and everyone who was anyone in the city's musical world was their dot men in crisp suits held forth on composers and theories. Women in elegant dresses listened, their smiles sharp and knowing. They were all masters of a language built on clefs and cadenzas, a world where a person's worth was often measured by the agility of their fingers and the prestige of their teachers. Moving through this glittering crowd, almost invisible, was the professor's wife. To the guests, she was simply Elena. She was a quiet presence in a simple, dove-gray dress, her hands often occupied with a tray of empty glasses or a platter of delicate canapes. She refilled a drink here, offered a napkin there, her movements efficient and silent. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense style, and her eyes, a soft shade of brown, seemed to take in everything while giving very little away. Most of the guests paid her no more mind than they would a well-placed piece of furniture. They knew the story, or thought they did. The brilliant Professor Finch, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, had married a woman from outside their world. She was not a fellow musician, not a patron of the arts, not from a notable family. She was, as one patron had once whispered a little too loudly, practical. She kept his home running smoothly, managed his social calendar, and asked for nothing more. To them, her silence was emptiness. Her simplicity was a lack of depth. Professor Finch himself, a tall man with silvering hair and a carefully trimmed beard, was holding court near the grand piano. He was explaining the complexities of a modern piece to a small, rapt circle. His voice was confident, an instrument he played as well as any piano. He loved these nights, loved being the center of this rarefied universe. His eyes occasionally flicked to his wife, and a faint, almost imperceptible line would appear between his brows before he smoothed it away with another practiced remark. In another corner, watching Elena with the cold interest of a cat watching a bird, was Lydia Vance. Lydia was Finch's star pupil, a young woman whose talent was only matched by her certainty of her own greatness. She had won competitions, her photo was in magazines, and she carried herself with the sleek, dangerous grace of someone who had never been told no. She wore a dress of crimson silk that seemed to dare anyone to look away. To Lydia, Elena was a puzzle, and a distasteful one. How could a man of such refinement be tied to such a plain, ordinary creature? The very sight of the professor's wife quietly clearing a discarded champagne flute offended Lydia's sense of how the world should be ordered. The evening's musical entertainment was, of course, to be provided by Lydia. It was an open secret that this soiree was as much a showcase for her as it was for the professor. The piece chosen was monstrously difficult, a contemporary work called Etude des Ombres, Study of Shadows. It was a storm of discordant notes, violent jumps, and rhythms that fought against each other. It was the kind of piece that was less about melody and more about athleticism and intellectual conquest. The conservatory crowd loved it. It was a badge of honor to appreciate its harsh beauty. As the guests settled, Lydia took her place at the magnificent Steinway Grand. A hush fell. She lifted her hands, let them hover for a dramatic moment, and then attacked the keys. The opening was a thunderclap of sound that made several people jump. She played with fierce precision, her fingers a blur, her body tense with concentration. She was technically flawless, hitting every brutal cluster of notes, navigating every tricky rhythm shift. But as the piece moved into a slower, more introspective section, something tiny wavered. A shadow of hesitation. a chord that didn't ring with the same conviction. It was a small thing, meaningless to most in the room, but in the hypercritical air of the conservatory, it was like a tear in fine silk. Lydia felt it. Her jaw tightened. She pushed on, but the magic, the illusion of effortless mastery, was broken. By the time she reached the final crashing crescendo, her performance felt less like a revelation and more like a difficult task completed. Polite, warm applause filled the room. Professor Finch clapped, a proud, paternal smile on his face. But Lydia heard the politeness in it. She stood, her cheeks flushed not with triumph, but with a hot, prickling shame. Her eyes, sharp and seeking a target for her frustration, swept across the faces of the admirers. And then they landed on Elena. Elena was standing by the doorway to the kitchen, one hand resting lightly on the frame. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were still listening to an echo of the last note. There was no judgment on her face, only that same quiet attentiveness. But to Lydia, in that moment, that quietness looked like critique. That simplicity looked like pity. A dangerous idea bloomed in Lydia's mind. It would be a joke, a deflection. It would turn the room's attention away from her minor faltering and onto something truly, humorously incompetent. It would reestablish the natural order. She smoothed her crimson dress and let a sweet, false smile touch her lips. "Thank you, she said, her voice cutting through the applause. She paused, letting the room quiet. "You know, music is for everyone to feel, isn't it? Not just for us to analyze to death." She turned her gaze, and everyone else's, directly toward the doorway. "Professor Finch, your wife has such a peaceful presence. She listens so deeply. I've often seen her looking at the piano in your study." She paused, her eyes glittering. "Perhaps she would like to play something for us next? A little ditty? To cleanse our palates after all that modern noise?" A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Then a few stifled giggles. The idea was absurd. The professor's wife, who fetched tea and arranged flowers, playing after Lydia Vance? It was like asking a kitchen maid to critique a symphony. Professor Finch's proud smile vanished. He looked from Lydia's challenging smile to his wife's still face. He felt a spike of anger at Lydia, but a stronger, more urgent wave of embarrassment. A scene here, in front of everyone, would be worse. If Elena simply refused, it would be awkward. If she tried and failed spectacularly, it would be a humiliation he would never live down. He decided on the path of least resistance, the one that would end this foolishness fastest. "My dear," he said, his voice hearty but strained. He walked over to Elena, taking her arm gently but firmly. "Lydia has made a kind suggestion. Why don't you come play something simple? A scale, perhaps? For fun." His eyes pleaded with her to cooperate, to get this over with. All eyes were on Elena. She looked at her husband's anxious face. She saw the mixture of amusement and curiosity on the faces of the guests. She saw Lydia's triumphant, mocking stare. For a long second, she said nothing. The room held its breath. Then, without a word, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She let Professor Finch lead her across the room, the sea of expensive suits and silk dresses parting for them. The walk to the piano felt miles long. Whispers followed her, sounds she pretended not to hear. "How brave," someone murmured, not meaning it. "Oh, the poor thing," said another. She reached the Steinway. The bench was still warm from Lydia. Professor Finch gave her shoulder a faint, encouraging pat that felt more like a push. "Just a little something, darling. Don't be nervous." Elena sat down. The ivory keys stretched out before her, a landscape of black and white that seemed both familiar and vast. The room was utterly silent now, waiting for the inevitable charming mistake. She placed her hands in her lap, her head bowed. She looked to everyone watching, like a woman praying for the ground to swallow her whole. Lydia, from her spot by the mantelpiece, allowed herself a real smile now. This was better than a perfect performance. This would be a story they'd tell for years. Professor Finch closed his eyes for a brief second, steeling himself. Elena took a slow, soft breath. And then she raised her hands. The silence in the grand hall was a heavy, expectant thing. It was the kind of silence that comes before a punchline, thick with held-back smiles and polite pity. Every person in the room was looking at the woman sitting at the great piano. To them, she looked small against its polished black bulk. Her simple gray dress seemed to fade into the shadows around the instrument. Elena placed her hands on her lap, not on the keys. Her head was bowed, her eyes closed. She didn't look like a musician preparing to play. She looked like someone gathering strength, or perhaps saying goodbye to her dignity. Professor Finch, standing a few feet away, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The seconds stretched. A small, nervous cough came from the back of the room. He was about to step forward, to gently call the whole thing off, to save them all from this painful charade. Then she moved Dot. It wasn't a dramatic movement, but it was a change. Her shoulders, usually rounded slightly from a life of quiet tasks, straightened. The line of her back became firm, not stiff, but settled, like a tree finding its roots. She lifted her head and opened her eyes. She wasn't looking at the guests, or at her husband. She was looking at the piano, but not at its surface. She was looking into it, as if seeing the hidden strings and hammers inside the great wooden body. When she finally raised her hands, something in the room shifted. It was hard to say what. The light, maybe. Or the air. The hands that had just moments before been carrying a tray of empty glasses now hovered above the ivory keys. They were capable-looking hands, but not delicate. There were faint traces of old scars near the thumb, tiny lines that spoke of work, not just practice. But their posture was different now. The fingers were curved with a natural, easy authority that made Lydia Vance, watching from beside the fireplace, feel a sudden, cold prickling on her skin. The guests expected a fumbling scale. They expected a hesitant children's tune played with one finger. They were ready to offer kind, condescending applause. Elena did not play the crushing opening chord of the difficult piece Lydia had just performed. Instead, her right hand descended, and from a single key in the middle of the piano, she drew out a note. It was so soft, it was almost a breath. But it wasn't just a note. It was a tone that seemed to hang in the air, full and round and lonely. It was the pure, clear heart of a bell, heard from very far away. Then, with her left hand, she added another note, low and soft, a shadow to the first. It wasn't part of the written music everyone knew. It was an echo, a memory of the piece that hadn't been played yet. The two notes together created a space, a feeling of vast, empty hallways and forgotten rooms. It was the musical equivalent of a single candle being lit in a dark cathedral. Professor Finch's professional mind, which had been buzzing with annoyance and embarrassment, went suddenly, utterly quiet. His eyebrows drew together. This was no accident. The touch, the control of the sound. It was pristine. It was the kind of soft playing that only the greatest control could achieve, where the note speaks instead of shouts. Before anyone could process this, Elena's right hand began to move. It wasn't the violent, athletic sprint Lydia had performed. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding. She began to play the main thematic thread, Etude des Ombres, but she played it as no one in that conservatory ever had. They played it as a series of intellectual problems to be solved, a jump here, a dissonant cluster there. Elena played it as a story, the harsh, clashing chords that were meant to sound like shattering glass. She played with a deep, resonant sorrow. They didn't jar the ear. They ached. The rapid, skittering passages in the upper register that Lydia had played with brilliant, cold speed, Elena played with the sound of whispered secrets, almost too fast to hear, yet every note distinct. She wasn't fighting the piano. She was conversing with it. Her body moved with a gentle, flowing rhythm that was completely unlike Lydia's tense concentration. It was as if the music was moving through her, not from her. The room was no longer silent with expectation. It was silent with shock. The polite smiles had vanished. Glasses of champagne, halfway to lips, were held frozen. Maestro Renaud, the elderly head of the conservatory, who had been nodding off in a wing-back chair, was now leaning forward, his mouth slightly open. His hearing aid pointed directly at the piano. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Her own performance, which moments ago felt like a minor triumph of skill, now felt like what it was, a clever robot reproducing a complex code. Elena's playing had weather in it. It had the chill of a long winter and the faint, desperate hope of a thaw. She was uncovering layers in the music the composer probably hoped were there, but rarely heard. Professor Finch felt as if the floor beneath him had turned to sand. He knew this piece. He taught this piece. He had written a paper on its structural innovations. But he was hearing it for the first time. The notes were the same, but the soul was entirely new, and it was a soul his wife had somehow kept hidden from him for years. He looked at her profile, lit by the soft light from the piano lamp. The calm, focused expression on her face was one he had never seen. This wasn't his quiet, practical wife. This was a stranger, a woman of immense and secret power. Elena reached the cadenza, the part of the piece, designed as a soloist's explosive showcase, a torrent of notes meant to stun an audience with sheer difficulty. Lydia had attacked it like a soldier storming a wall. Elena did something else entirely. She took the furious running notes and gave them shape. She found a wild, desperate melody hiding within the chaos. She played it not with anger, but with a heartbreaking urgency, the notes tumbling over one another like someone trying to outrun a memory. The technical precision was still. Their every note in the blindingly fast runs was clear as a raindrop, but it was pressed into the service of all, feeling so raw that several people in the audience found themselves holding their breath. A man near the back, a wealthy patron who funded the conservatory's new wing, felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He wasn't a sentimental man, but the music wasn't asking for sentiment. It was speaking of a loss so deep it had become quiet. He looked at the simple woman at the piano, her face serene amidst the storm she was creating, and he understood, with a jolt, that he had never truly heard music before this moment. As the final section approached, the piece called for a return to the brutal, pounding chords of the opening. Lydia had played them with a final, defiant bang, slamming the door shut. Elena played them differently. She let the chaos subside, not into silence, but into a deep, weary resolution. The last chords were not loud. They were heavy, like stones being laid gently on a grave. They echoed in the hall, and then faded, not into nothing, but into a profound and ringing quiet. Her hands came to rest back in her lap. The echo of the last note was absorbed by the carpets, the curtains, the stunned faces of the people in the room. For a long moment, nothing happened. No one clapped. No one moved. The usual rules had broken. The performance had been too personal, too real for the simple ritual of applause. It felt like they had all been caught staring through a keyhole into a private world, and they were ashamed of their earlier laughter. Elena sat perfectly still, her eyes now on the keys in front of her, as if listening to the ghost of the sound she had just released into the world. The humble mask was gone, burned away by the fire of the music. What was left was a face etched with a deep, quiet exhaustion, and a piece that looked hard won, The spell was finally broken by the sharp, clear sound of shattering crystal. Maestro Renaud had tried to take a sip of his water, but his hand was trembling so badly the glass had slipped from his fingers and exploded on the parquet floor. No one even turned to look at the noise. All eyes remained fixed on the woman at the piano. The sound of the shattering glass seemed to hang in the air, a sharp, real-world punctuation to the dream that had just unfolded. But nobody moved to clean it up. The glittering pieces lay on the floor, forgotten. Every person in the room was caught between two impossible truths. The woman they thought they knew, and the music they had just heard. It was Maestro Renaud who broke the stillness. He didn't look at the mess he'd made. He pushed himself up from his chair, his old bones moving slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena. He walked toward the piano as if drawn by a magnet, his steps quiet on the thick carpet. He stopped a few feet from her, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him to hide their shaking. "Madame Finch," he said. His voice, usually a booming instrument used to command orchestras, was a dry whisper. It was the only sound in the vast room. "Please, you must tell us. Who taught you?" The question seemed to unlock the room. A wave of sound rushed in, gasps, murmurs, the rustle of fabric as people leaned forward. Professor Finch stood rooted to the spot, his mind a blank page. The technical analysis that usually ran like a scroll in his head had short-circuited. All he could think was, asterisk, she never played. Not once. Not in all our years. Asterisk. He remembered the small, upright piano in his study, dusted but silent. He had assumed she had no interest. Elena looked up from the keys. The profound, distant expression in her eyes softened, receding like a tide. She was back in the room now, feeling the weight of all those stares. She saw her husband's confusion, the maestro's awe, and the sea of shocked faces. A faint flush of pink appeared on her cheeks, but it wasn't the blush of embarrassment. It was the heat of a secret, long kept, suddenly exposed to the light. She didn't answer the maestro. Instead, she slowly stood up from the piano bench. The simple movement seemed monumental. She smoothed the front of her plain gray dress, a familiar, humble gesture that now seemed utterly strange, coming from the person who had just commanded the instrument with such power. "It was a long time ago," she said finally. Her voice was still soft, but it carried in the silent hall. It had a different quality to it, now not timid, but tired. A tiredness that went deep into the bones. But where? Professor Finch heard himself ask. The words came out sharper than he intended, edged with a confusion that was tipping into something like hurt. "You never said. You never once mentioned you could play." Elena turned her head and looked at him. In her gaze, he saw sadness he didn't understand. "You never asked, Alistair," she said quietly. "And it wasn't something I carried with me anymore." Lydia Vance found her voice then. The cold shock was burning away, replaced by a hotter, more familiar feeling, outrage. This was a trick. It had to be. This quiet, nothing woman could not possibly possess something Lydia had worked her entire life for. "That's impossible," Lydia said, her tone cutting through the murmurs. She took a step forward, her crimson dress like a wound against the muted room. "No one plays like that without training, without a name. Who was your teacher?" Elena met Lydia's challenging stare. There was no fight in her eyes, only a weary patience. "My first teacher was my grandmother," she said, "in our village. The piano was very old. It was always out of tune. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a memory from another world. Later, there were others. In the city." "Which city?" Maestro Renaud pressed, taking another step closer. His mind was racing through a list of legendary pedagogues, trying to connect them to this enigma before him. Elena hesitated. She looked around the room at the eager, hungry faces. These people lived on names, on pedigrees. They wanted a story that fit their world. Hers didn't. It was far from here, she said, evading. A different life. But the old maestro was a bloodhound when it came to talent. The clues were there, the specific weight of her touch, the old-school phrasing in the lyrical passages, even the slight, almost erased accent in certain words that he'd always assumed was a regional quirk. His eyes widened. The control in the left hand, the singing tone in the upper register. He mumbled to himself, then his head snapped up. Karpova, he breathed, the name a holy relic in certain musical circles. Elena Karpova. The name meant nothing to most of the wealthy patrons, but it hit the musicians in the room like a physical blow. Professor Finch actually staggered back a half step, as if pushed. His mouth fell open. Karpova, the child prodigy from the East, the girl who had won the prestigious Lundal competition at 12, playing Rachmaninoff with the soul of an old woman. The one who had disappeared from the stage just as suddenly a few years later. Rumors had swirled a breakdown, a family tragedy, a loss of passion. She had vanished into myth. All eyes swiveled back to the woman in the gray dress. She closed her eyes for a second, as if the name was a key, turning in a long locked door. When she opened them, she gave the smallest, faintest nod. That was a name I used. A long time ago. The room erupted, but not with applause. It erupted with a cacophony of questions, exclamations, disbelief. The child prodigy? She vanished. But she's here? Professor Finch felt the world tilt on its axis. He had married a myth. He had shared a home, a life, with a ghost from the concert stages he studied and wrote about. He thought of the times he had lectured her about music over dinner, explaining basic concepts, feeling patient and wise. Heat flooded his face, a scalding wave of shame. He had been condescending to a master. Lydia looked like she had been slapped. All her achievements, her competitions, her fierce pride, shrank to nothing in the shadow of that name. Karpova's early recordings were still used in master classes as examples of impossible, innate musicality. To be beaten by a rival was one thing. To be effortlessly, utterly eclipsed by a living legend you had just tried to humiliate was another. The anger drained from her, leaving behind a hollow, icy feeling of insignificance. Maestro Renaud ignored everyone else. He moved right up to Elena, his old hands reaching out as if to touch a precious artifact, but he stopped himself. "You stopped," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You had such a gift. The world lost. Why?" This was the question the whole room now held. The silence returned, deeper than before. Galena looked past him, out the tall windows into the darkening night. Her face, in the soft light, seemed older. "The world was very loud," she said simply. "And the music, it became a thing to win, to conquer. It started in here," she touched her temple, "and not here." She placed a hand gently over her heart. "My family? There was an accident. The things that were loud became meaningless. The music, the real music, became a private thing, a thing for mourning, not for stages." She looked back at her husband. "When I met Alistair, it was a chance for quiet, for a different kind of life. He wanted a quiet wife, and I wanted to be one." Professor Finch heard the words, and each one landed like a stone. He wanted a quiet wife. He had. He had loved her calm, her steadiness, the way she created a peaceful, orderly haven from the competitive noise of the conservatory. He had never once wondered what might be living beneath that calm. He had mistaken depth for simplicity. He saw it all now. The way she would sometimes pause while dusting the piano in his study, her fingers just brushing the closed lid. The distant look in her eyes when he played recordings of great pianists, a look he had mistaken for a lack of understanding. The profound, unshakable peace she carried, which he had thought was innocence, but was in fact the peace that culminates on the far side of great fire and great loss. He had built his life on the surface of things, on technique, on reputation, on the visible signs of success. She had built hers, silently, in the depths, and he had never bothered to look down. The wealthy patron who had felt a tightness in his throat during her playing now felt a different kind of ache. He looked at the professor, a man he had respected for his sharp mind, and now saw a man who was blind. He looked at the young prodigy in the red dress, her confidence shattered, and saw the hollow hunger of a world that valued noise over soul. And he looked at the woman in gray, who had given them a glimpse of that soul, and felt a staggering sense of awe and of regret for all the things he himself had been too busy to hear. The air in the grand hall didn't feel like party air anymore. It felt charged, like after a lightning strike. The shock had settled, but the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. People weren't sure where to look at the shattered glass on the floor, at the legendary maestro standing like a supplicant, or at the quiet woman who had just rewritten the evening's entire story. Elena's confession hung in the silence. She was Elena Karpova, the vanished child, the ghost, and she was here, in their midst, having passed the canapé. Acute S. Professor Finch finally found his legs. He walked toward his wife, his steps slow and unsteady. He stopped a few feet from her, seeing her as if for the first time. The familiar lines of her face were the same, but the person behind them was a stranger. He searched for anger, for betrayal, but all he felt was a dizzying vertigo, as if the solid ground of his own life had crumbled away. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual professor's certainty. Helena looked at him, and her gaze was gentle but unwavering. "At first it was too painful to speak of," she said, her words measured. "The life before, the loss, the music was tied to all of it. When I came here, I wanted to leave that girl behind. She was burned out, empty." She glanced around the opulent room. "And you, Alistair, you were so full of this world. Your talk was of competitions, of critics, of legacy. You loved the idea of a wife who was separate from all that. A calm harbor. Telling you would have complicated it. You would have looked at me as a pianist first, not a person. And I didn't want to be a pianist anymore. I just wanted to be." Her words were simple, but they landed with a devastating clarity. He had loved the idea of her simplicity. He had never asked what might be beneath it. He had been, he realized with a sickening jolt, a snob. He had valued her for not being part of his competitive world, all the while being completely blind to the profound artistry she carried within her. His expertise, his reputation, felt like a cardboard crown. Across the room, Lydia Vance was grappling with a different kind of collapse. Her world was built on being the best, on being seen, acknowledged, and feared. The woman she had tried to mock was not just better. She was from a different universe of talent altogether. The recording of the child Karpova was a thing of awe in student circles, a reminder of a raw, natural genius that couldn't be manufactured. To have insulted that, to have reduced it to a joke, made Lydia feel small and foolish in a way no criticism ever had. The heat of her shame was unbearable. She wanted to disappear, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Maestro Renaud was not thinking of shame or pride. His old heart was pounding with a wild, sudden hope. He ignored the professor and stepped closer to Elena. "My dear," he said, and his voice was full of a reverence usually reserved for composers long dead. "What you have, what you just showed us, It cannot be locked away. The world needs to hear this. Not the noisy world you left, but the real world. Our students. He gestured wildly, encompassing the stunned faculty members in the room. They learn the notes. They learn the technique. They do not learn that. He pointed a trembling finger at the piano. You must teach. You must come to the conservatory. A master class. A position. Name it. A fresh murmur ran through the crowd. A professorship for the wife who served the drinks? But no one could laugh now. The idea, which would have been absurd an hour ago, now seemed not just logical, but urgently necessary. Elena shook her head, a firm but quiet movement. No, she said. Not like that. No more stages. No more. Performance. The maestro's face fell. But he was a stubborn man, a man who had fought for music his whole life. He could see the steel in her quiet refusal, so he changed tactics. Then not for the public, he pleaded. For them. He turned and pointed a bony finger directly at Lydia. For her. She has the fingers of a devil, but the heart of a stone. You could show her. One lesson, please. All eyes turned to Lydia. Her face, already pale, went ashen. To be singled out as the hard-hearted student, offered up as a charity case to the woman she had mocked, was the ultimate humiliation. She flinched as if struck. Elena studied Lydia. She saw not a cruel girl, but a frightened one, a creature built entirely on a fragile tower of achievement that had just been shaken to its foundation. She saw a younger version of what she herself might have become. It is not for me to fix a stone heart, Elena said softly, and Lydia looked down, unable to bear her gaze. A heart must choose to open itself. She paused, thinking. The room waited, hanging on her next words. She looked from the wealthy, expectant faces of the patrons to the eager, anxious faces of the professors, and then past them, as if seeing something else. There is a man, she said, her voice gaining a little strength. He comes in the early morning to clean the practice rooms. Sometimes, when he thinks no one is there, he sings old folk songs. His voice is true, and it comes from a place of memory, not training. She looked at Maestro Renaud and the woman in the cafeteria, the one with the kind eyes. Her fingers are stiff from work, but on her break, she sits at the old upright in the storage room and picks out hymns, slowly, full of feeling. She took a step forward, addressing the room now. You have a building full of people who love music in their bones, not in their ambitions. You look past them to find the next star. Her eyes settled on her husband. You celebrate the difficult piece played perfectly, but you do not hear the simple scale played with a true sadness or a real joy. Professor Finch felt each word like a pinprick. It was a critique of his entire life's philosophy. Elena turned back to the maestro. I will not take a post, but I will come. One time. I will sit in the main hall where everyone can come. Not a master class for the chosen few. An open hour for anyone in this building who wishes to play. Not to be judged, but to be listened to. The cleaning man, if he wishes to sing his song. The cafeteria worker with her hymn. And yes, she said, finally looking at Lydia, the prodigy with her difficult piece. But only if she comes not to show me, but to share. To ask a real question. The proposal was so unexpected, so utterly outside the conservatory's way of doing things, that for a moment, no one knew what to say. An open session? For anyone? Maestro Renaud blinked. It was not what he wanted. He wanted to parade her, to have her brilliance rub off on his institution's reputation. But he was also, in his soul, a musician. He remembered the sound she had pulled from the piano, a sound of profound humanity. Perhaps, he thought with a sudden, strange hope, this was the only way to get a piece of it. Perhaps this was the lesson they all needed. "Yes," he said, the word bursting from him. "Yes, we will do it. This open hour. You set the terms." Lydia finally looked up. The offer wasn't pity. It wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation to something completely different. To play not for a prize, but for a moment of connection. The thought was terrifying and confusing, and for the first time that night, it sparked a tiny, fragile curiosity beneath the shame. Professor Finch watched his wife. In her quiet defiance, in her unexpected terms, he saw the strength of the girl who had conquered stages and then walked away from them. He saw a person of immense will who had chosen a simple life not out of weakness, but out of a deep, powerful knowing. He had spent his life building a statue of himself for the world to admire. She had spent hers tending a small, sacred fire, and only now had they all felt its heat. He didn't know this woman, but for the first time, he desperately wanted to. News, in a place like the Conservatory, was a living thing. It breathed through the practice room doors, whispered in the hallways, and echoed in the cafeteria line. The story of what happened at the professor's party didn't just spread. It mutated, grew wings. It became a legend. The simple wife, the ghost prodigy, the phantom of Ethelgerd. For days, it was all anyone could talk about. Professor Finch moved through his lectures like a man in a fog. Students looked at him differently now. There was less fear in their eyes, and more curiosity, sometimes pity. He found he couldn't bear to be in his own study, where the silent piano now seemed to accuse him. He started taking long walks, trying to remember the quiet moments with his wife over the years, seeing them now in a completely new light. Lydia Vance stopped coming to classes for 3 days. When she returned, she was different. The sharp, defiant edge was gone. She was quieter, her shoulders less squared. She practiced still, but the furious, relentless pounding had softened. Sometimes she would just sit at the piano, her hands in her lap, thinking. The question Elena had posed hung in the air. Asterisk, did she want to share, or just to show? She didn't know the answer, yet the announcement for the open hour, was posted on a simple piece of paper, without fancy letterhead. It stated a time and place, the main performance hall, Saturday at 10 in the morning. At the bottom, in Elena's own handwriting, it said, "For anyone who carries a tune in their heart." The conservatory's elite students sneered at first. An open invitation? It was beneath them. But the sneer didn't last. The memory of the music from the party was too strong. A nervous, buzzing energy began to build. Saturday morning arrived, gray and drizzly. The main hall, usually reserved for formal recitals and visiting dignitaries, felt strangely solemn. The velvet seats were empty, but the floor space in front of the stage was dotted with people. It was a sight no one at Ethelgerd had ever seen. There was indeed the older man from the cleaning staff, in his comfortable shoes, holding his cap nervously in his hands. The kind-eyed woman from the cafeteria stood near him, her fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan. A first-year violin student, known for his terrible stage fright, sat on the edge of the stage, his case clutched to his chest. A few curious professors lingered in the shadows at the back, and in a corner, half hidden by a pillar, stood Lydia Vance. Professor Finch stood at the very back near the doors. He needed to see this, but he couldn't bring himself to get closer. At exactly 10 o'clock, a side door opened. Elena walked in. She wore another simple dress, this one a deep blue. She carried no music, no mag. She walked to the center of the stage, where a single piano stood, but she did not sit at it. She sat on a plain wooden chair placed beside it. She looked out at the small, mismatched group on the floor and smiled. It wasn't a grand smile. It was a warm, acknowledging one. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calm and clear in the hushed hall. This is not a class. I am not here to teach you technique. The master's here, she nodded toward the back, do that very well. I am here only to listen, and perhaps to talk about what happens before the fingers move. Who would like to begin? A long, awkward silence followed. The cleaning man looked at his shoes. The cafeteria woman bit her lip. Then, a small sound. The first-year violinist, his face white, stood up on trembling legs. He mumbled something about a short piece by Bach. Play it for us. Elena said gently. The boy's performance was technically shaky. His bow arm trembled. A few notes were sour. When he finished, he looked down, expecting dismissal. The professors at the back shifted, their professional minds cataloging the errors. Elena didn't speak about the errors. You love that melody, she said. The boy looked up, surprised. I could hear it. You were holding your breath in the second phrase, waiting for it to return, like waiting for a friend. That is where the music lives. Try to breathe with it next time, not against it. The boy blinked and slowly nodded. It was the first feedback he'd ever gotten that wasn't about his stiff wrist. Encouraged, the cafeteria worker went next. She sat at a piano, her work-roughened hands hovering over the keys. She played a simple, old hymn. It was slow. A chord was missed, but she played it with a deep, reverent tenderness. When she finished, her cheeks were flushed. That was a prayer, Elena said softly. You didn't just play the notes. You remembered someone. You offered something. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she just nodded, unable to speak. One by one, others came. A shy clarinetist. A pianist who only knew pop songs by ear. Elena listened to each with absolute focus. Her comments were never about right or wrong. They were about feeling. That sounds like a blue sky. There's a hesitation there. Is the music asking a question? She spoke of color, of weather, of memory. It was a language most of them had forgotten, buried under years of instructions about metronomes and fingering. Finally, from the corner, Lydia Vance moved. She walked to the piano, not with her usual proud stride, but with a quiet determination. She didn't look at anyone. She sat and without a word began to play. It was not the fierce modern piece from the party. It was a Chopin nocturne, something lyrical and vulnerable. She played it beautifully, of course. The technique was flawless. But halfway through, in a tender, rising passage, her voice cut through the music, small and unsure. Here, she said, the music still flowing under her words. It feels like it should. Ache more. But I don't know how to make it. Elena stood and walked to the piano. She did not take Lydia's place. She simply stood beside her. You are trying to put the ache in with your fingers, Elena said. It does not work that way. Think of a time you waited for something that never came. Just for a second. Don't play it. Feel it. Then let the finger fall. Lydia closed her eyes. The music had stopped. The hall was utterly still. They saw her throat constrict. A single brief flicker of pain passed over her face. Then she opened her eyes, placed her finger on the key, and played the single singing note. It was a different sound. Richer, lonelier, true. A shuddering breath escaped Lydia. It wasn't a lesson in technique. It was a lesson in surrender. The hour ended. People left the hall not chattering, but quietly, as if leaving a sacred space. The cleaning man was humming. The cafeteria worker was smiling through her tears. Professor Finch watched his wife. She was speaking softly to the young violinist now. He saw the way the students and staff looked at her, not with the awe of celebrity, but with the gratitude of being seen. Truly seen. He had spent a lifetime demanding respect from this place. She had earned a deeper thing reverence in a single morning, simply by offering kindness and truth. He finally understood. His world was a pyramid, with him struggling near the top. Her world was a circle, where everyone who loved sound had a place. He had valued the destination. She valued the journey. That evening, he went home. He found Elena in the small garden behind their house, her hands in the soil, tending to her roses. The quiet domestic scene that had once symbolized her simplicity to him now felt like a choice of immense strength. He didn't know where to start. There was too much to say, too much to apologize for. So he just said, "The boy, the violinist. You saw something in him I never would have." Elena looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. "He was not playing to impress," she said. "He was playing to understand. That is an honest place to begin." Finch nodded. He stood there for a moment, the damp evening air between them. "May I—" he began, then stopped. "Would it be all right if I sometimes listen to you play? Not to teach, just to listen." Elena studied his face. She saw the shattered pride, the honest confusion, and the first fragile glimmer of a new kind of respect. She gave a slow nod. "You may," she said, "but you must listen with your heart, not your critic's ear. It is a different instrument." Inside the conservatory, the legend of the phantom prodigy slowly turned into something else. The story of the listening woman. The grand hall was never quite the same. Students sometimes paused in their relentless pursuit of perfection, remembering that music was, first, a feeling. Lydia Vance began to visit the storage room to hear the cafeteria worker play her hymns, finding in their simplicity a comfort her complex etudes never provided. And in a quiet house, a husband finally began to hear the silent song his wife had been living all along. He had wanted a sanctuary from the noise of his world. He never realized he had been living with the source of the deepest quiet and the most profound music all along. The performance was over. The duet, at last, had a chance to begin.